what is the evidence that there has been a change in retirement behaviours, and what are the key drivers?
There's some research that's come out recently done by YouGov, and one of the questions that was asked, well, what are your biggest financial concerns? And this is all employees, so all employees from young to those perhaps approaching retirement. And the second biggest worry for everyone was not being able to afford to retire. When you get to age 44 plus, that was the single biggest worry. So, you know, you've got some things like that going on, but you've also got these recent years have changed people's retirement behaviours. So, for example, you've got more people who are now genuinely believing they can't afford to retire, pushing retirement back, most of them deferring. You've got 35% of people aged 55 plus deferring retirement and pushing it back, and another 9% saying that they remain anxious and uncertain. So that's the backdrop that employers are having to grapple with, and individuals, and I'm not sure that anybody's kind of caught up with that yet, but they need to, because the impact of that is not just on the individual, but it's also on the organisation, with things like the uncertainty about recruitment, people development, succession blocks, and actually that really, you know, difficult nut to crack, which is wanting to retain talent and experience, but also wanting to support people to retire well.
What are the changing retirement behaviours that you're seeing, Jeanette, and perhaps your team here at Close Brothers are seeing, that you don't think employers are aware that are coming down the line, especially when it comes to how employees want to retire in terms of their flexibility and what their finances are looking like?
Yeah, well, we are seeing a change in retirement behaviours. We're seeing a change at employee level. I guess some of our concerns is whether there's any latency there in organisations spotting that, because obviously now individuals, retirement is an individual decision. It kind of always has been, right? But with more prevalence of defined contribution pensions, the decision making is wholly led by the individual, health besides, but wholly led by the individual. And there's no trigger, there's no age trigger or contract trigger or whatever. So, you know, individuals might be thinking some things, but at what point is that communicated to the employer? At what point is that spotted as a trend across that whole cohort? And we've just talked earlier about the changes that we are seeing because of the difficult financial circumstances that we've been through and that we're still in. Affordability is the very first point on any person's retirement plan. And so if they feel affordability is in jeopardy, they push retirement back. They walk away from that decision for a while. But our employers spotting that. And we're seeing that in the research, and we're seeing that at individual employee level. But our concern is that that maybe isn't yet being spotted, or spotted to the extent at organisational level. And I just don't know that anybody's looking at this at the moment, and that's anybody at organisational level in seeing this impact and the knock-on effect, but also from a provider perspective. So, you know, our pension providers changing the way they're interacting with that group, that cohort who are in that track towards retirement. We're not really seeing that sort of agility of response and changing to something that has actually and could potentially have a big impact in the workplace.
When we got onto that last week, we saw that a number of employers were quite sensitive about raising the issue about retiring or how people might want to work in the future. And they can be very sensitive, linked to age, of what employees might think. How do they tackle such a sensitive issue and get the insight from the employees of what they're thinking?
Yeah, and you're right. I think that came out in the discussion last week. It is a very sensitive area because, of course, employers don't want people to feel uncomfortable. They don't want people to feel that they are targeting them for retirement, but at the same time supporting that transition and having something that is more normalised, that is structured, so actually they can put the right support in, one. They can also plan, two. There's nothing wrong with either of those two things. And actually that the employees know that. I think that's the thing. If it's normal practice and it's not targeted at individuals or a cohort, but it's support that's available to everybody who is thinking of that, it becomes something that then is a support mechanism and is something that's routine and normalised rather than something that's targeted. And I think that's the differentiation there. And one of the big questions that was asked of the people, for example, that have deferred their retirement or who are uncertain about it, what would help you? What's the single biggest thing that would help you? And they all to a man said, and to a man to a woman said, knowing when I could afford to retire. So knowing from their point of view, they may not choose to do it at that point, but affordability has to be the first box that is ticked on that plan first. After that, it's then about choice and when and how that fits with lifestyle. So actually putting a provision in place that makes that affordability certain for every individual, I think is key to helping people plan and to remove that uncertainty. And if you remove that uncertainty for the individual, then en masse, that uncertainty becomes clearer for the organisation.
So we saw last week that PLSA had published their new living standards, and within that, quite big rises in what employees need to have set aside to have a reasonable retirement to live on. So what does that mean in terms of what employers need to be telling their employees to help them reach those levels?
Let's start with the PLSA Retirement Living Standards are a guide, right? They're not going to be the same for every individual. Every individual's unique, and that bundle of things that they put in the shopping basket to make up those numbers will vary individual to an individual. But when you're talking about retirement, even when you're coming into the workplace, when you start work, you have to have something to aim for, a goal. And so those retirement living standards are a fantastic aim to give you an idea of, okay, what might I want in retirement and how does that work for my plans? The numbers actually, if we take a single person, they have three standards. They have a basic, a moderate and a comfortable. And if we just look at sort of middle of the road, the moderate standard for a single individual, it's gone up from 23,300 a year to 31,300 a year. So that's a 34% increase. That is huge, an £8,000 increase every year. If you think of, say, a 25-year retirement, times 8, I'll keep the math really simple because I can't in my head do compounding or interest or inflation rises. So excluding all those and keeping it really simple, 25 years at 8,000 a year, that's £200,000.
So that's quite a big gap that you've mentioned there, Jeanette. How can employers and providers work to help employees close that gap?
If it's recognised that this may cause more anxiety and more worry, and actually it may cause people to have to go back to the drawing board when it comes to their retirement plans, when it comes to their budgets, when it comes to their savings, we need to look at how principally the employer, because they're a conduit for all the communications, and the pension providers and other long-term savings providers, so obviously you've got other workplace savings as well, how they can help people to see how those gaps can be filled. Well, let's measure the gap first and foremost. So let's have a decent, easy to use modelers and tools that people can use, even a budget planner, even a budgeting retirement planner, to see that difference. Perhaps revealing what was in those baskets so people can see, oh, well, that's not for me, I don't need that. Oh, but I'd need something else as well. So I think a recognition of it, an acknowledgement of it, brushing under the carpet and ignoring it isn't going to help anyone. And then really looking at the support available. So as I say, putting some, so for example, you could break your employee demographics down into groups. So those people that are further away from retirement, say people at age, say 45 plus, they've still got time to do something. So let's put some communications and some workshops and some tools and some things around that to support those people in looking at, okay, you need to maybe look at, revisit and change your savings plans. For the people who are really at the point of retirement, maybe that is some one-to-one guidance clinics. So to sit with an advisor, for example, using a modelling tool and seeing the impact that has had on their plans, and seeing actually it's more than that. It's looking at, okay, what are the things that could be changed? And by changing that, what's the impact? By changing this, what's the impact? Because then the individual's got all the information they need to then go away and make a decision. And I think, you know, uncertainty about anything is hard to handle. Tough facts are hard to handle, but if you've got the facts, at least you know what you're dealing with and you can make a decision from that point forward.
So really, we're expecting a lot from employers, but I think many of them will turn to their providers, their advisors. What would you advise them to do to get more? What pressure could they put more on their providers and advisors to get what they need for their employees?
So that's a good point, and it's always a really good place to start, because obviously your providers are experts in their own field. So requiring them to deliver their expertise in the right way for your people, and I think that's a key point. You'll know your people better than anyone. You'll know your different cohorts. So even in the forum that we had last week, for example, we had some organisations there who had quite different employee demographics. So they had, for example, you know, cohorts of really high-paid individuals and cohorts of production line staff who were struggling to make ends meet, you know, week to week. So, you know, quite different backgrounds, and they have to encompass all of that. So actually, as a company, understanding your workforce, understanding your different cohorts, understanding their needs, I think is key. But as we've talked about earlier, there's a lot being required of certain providers at the moment, and we saw that in the forum as well. So it's fair to say that because the world's changed a bit, because there's more need for financial education, financial understanding, financial guidance, there is a recognition of that. Finances have become more complex, pensions have become more complex. There's more decisions down on the individual's shoulders now. So there's a lot more need for that sort of education, information, guidance and support. And understandably, there's a lot of organisations that have gone to existing providers to ask them for that. But I think we've seen actually there's maybe an expectations gap there because the providers are expert in their own field. If you ask them to step outside of that lane and do something that is not their core business, for them, A, recognise that that is a sideshow, it's not the main feature, and B, it's not their centre of expertise and it's not their core business. So I think expectation gap management, get your providers to do as much as they can to make what they do better. Better communications, simpler communications, better and consistent modelling tools, how to use those modelling tools, prompting the use of those at key stages, ensuring no employee is left behind, for example, that big data reporting back to the employer on groups that just aren't using the tools or whatever. Making the facts really clear and simple, not just relying on a pensions platform, for example. You know, what if people don't visit the pensions platform? So going back to something like the annual statement, if people see that and have it in their hands once a year, it's a prompt. If they have to go and do that themselves on the platform, what if they don't? So there's some simple, fairly fundamental things that could be done to improve that line of sight and communication, I think.
So given those challenges that you've just mentioned, what would you say good could look like?
The joining of the dots requires a financial education programme. It requires somebody to come in who is specialist at that in the workplace, but who is also independent of the benefits, if that makes sense. So they've got no skin in the game themselves. They're there to see what's on offer. They're there to talk about absolutely everything. And they're there to demystify it and to give employees real clues and real models as to how to use that to make a difference to their own finances. So that's really important. And also when you find it's done by somebody who isn't a pensions or benefits specialist, for example, it tends to be trusted more by the employees because of that independence.